Greetings and welcome to another edition of the Pedalshift Project. The Pedalshift Project is a series of conversations, thoughts, and experiments around the bike touring lifestyle. From tips and tricks to ideas on how to ride your ride, let's shrink the world by bike. Show notes and more are available at pedalshift.net/271, and you can email the show pedalshift@pedalshift.net or text me at 202-930-1109 and check Pedalshift out on all the socials as well. Hello everybody and welcome to the 271st edition of the Pedalshift Project. My name is Tim Mooney. Thanks so much for joining. On this edition, we are starting off our winter series talking all about route scouting, remote route scouting here on the show for the next several episodes. On this edition of the show, I'm talking about probably the one that started off my entire project doing this. And a little bit of a reminder, if you haven't been with the show in the last couple of episodes, what I am looking at is a route that would be new to me, or at least sufficiently new to me. We'll get into that a little bit later with some other routes that I'm kind of doing a little bit of rejiggering. But something that would kind of check a box on one of my goals for 2022, but also most importantly be something that I would do sometime in the spring. I think depending on the route, it would be potentially at different times. And there's also potentially some other schedule related things in my life that would dictate when these things happen. But no matter what, this would be for the spring tour. The first one, as I mentioned, the one that probably got me excited about this, about really looking at different new trips, is the Texas Hill Country Loop. And I'm pretty excited about this for a few reasons. Number one, as I mentioned, it is very much a brand new route for me. I have never ridden in the great state of Texas. I have heard amazing things about the area for cycling in and around the Austin part of the state. I have a little bit of experience in Austin, not a ton. Great town, really enjoyed it. I have a colleague at work who has sung the praises of the Texas Hill Country, and it is also, not so coincidentally for the reason why I'm looking at it, it's got an existing Adventure Cycling Association route, and that's kind of where I'd like to start the analysis for all of this. If you want to take a look at it, I'll have a link in the show notes to the ACA page for it. I think that it's an interesting start to it. There's also some corresponding folks who utilize Ride with GPS to show the map. I also have a link in the show notes to the map with resources attached to it, including camping and a whole variety of other things, which I think is really, really helpful. And I'll talk about those resources again in a little bit. It appears that this is a route that is super ideal in springtime. It is definitely not something that you would probably want to do in the summer because Texas, it's stupid hot in the summer, as many places are in the United States, but Texas in particular is stupid hot. So spring or fall tends to be the most recommended times to do it. And I think that from my perspective, I'm most looking at this as a possibility for a spring tour, just because timing is right for me, but also the wildflowers are apparently out in and around the roads of hill country along this ACA route, which I'm kind of intrigued with. I've always liked how spring flowers can just really brighten up a tour. No matter where I'm cycling, I always enjoy seeing flowers popping out. And apparently these are the real deal. This is one of the big reasons why a lot of people think that this is one of the best springtime tours that are potentially out there. I think that if you look at the ride itself, I'm just going to pull up you would think that I would have actually pulled up the map before I started this podcast, but I'll just riff until it actually pulls up. Just looking at the profile, the grade profile, it's very, as one would expect with hill country in the name of it, it certainly is all about rolling hills for a large portion of it. But the grades are never really terrible, with a few exceptions, I would say. And the elevation profile, if you look at it in the Ride with GPS link that again I have in the show notes, you're never really going much above 2,000 feet total along the whole thing. The overall ride profile looks like a relatively kind of relatively relaxed several days worth of riding, and only a few kind of larger climbs, I would say. There's one I'm looking at in particular that would be kind of on the last quarter of the trip that actually has a 9% grade for a fair amount of it. But that's the last real climb of note for the entire thing. You just look at it. There's 1, 2, 3. There's probably about 4 or 5 like larger climbs. And when I say large, they're steeper. They're not terribly long. So this is not, mountain kind of riding by any stretch of the imagination. The one thing that I would say about that though is, I think that when you're a fully loaded bike tourist, there are lots of schools of thought on all of this. I think for me, in some ways, I would rather have a relatively normal grade and steeper, like larger, longer climbs than a lot of up and downs. And that's the one downside to this route, is that it does appear to be a ton of up and downs. It's kind of what it's best known for. That's why a lot of road bikers really strongly like this ride, because you can get into that whole thing where you get into the rhythm of the hills, where you kind of push up a hill and then you pedal into the downhill a little bit, and then that downhill helps to push you up the next one, and you got that kind of roller coaster kind of mentality with the whole thing, and you can really bang out a ton of miles that way. I think when you're fully loaded, like I intend to be, it's a lot harder to pull off. And so it's a lot of kind of climb, go down, climb, go down. And that can wear on you over time. Logistically speaking, this is a fly in and out of Austin type of thing. And I will say that I'll talk about this more actually, I'll do a logistics session later. Let me just kind of give the bare bones of this at this point. Flying in and out of Austin is definitely the way this would go. This is a true loop, which I appreciate the ACA being able to come up with a loop, because that really is kind of helpful. So many of the tours that I'm going to be looking at and will be sharing with you over the course of the next few weeks are a lot of out and backs, and that's fine. But when you've got kind of a nice linear rail trail or a linear trail of any type, if you're going to be parking in one spot and you don't have the ability to get a sag wagon or otherwise get picked up at the other end, it is an out and back. Now, that's great if you've got the time for it and if you don't mind kind of exploring it that way. But I do love these routes that are packaged, if you will, as a place where you can fly in and out of the same type of place, or start at least and finish in the same place. So you could, whether you're parking a car or taking a plane, I think that's pretty great. So big ups on ACA for coming up with that. Based on mileage, I'm looking at this being somewhere in the 5 to 6 day kind of realm, and it's hard to kind of assess. I haven't really broken it down too much in my head about, okay, what time would I be arriving? Would I stay in Austin the first night? Kind of what are the logistics around that? And again, we'll get to dive a little deeper into logistics in a little bit here, but it does appear to be 5 to 6 days in that kind of wheelhouse of 60-mile-ish days. Now, most of this would be camping. I do think that there are opportunities for roofed lodging throughout all of this. Whether they would be necessary or not is an open question. I think for anything less than a week, I can almost always justify doing a full camping trip. Maybe depending on kind of the rhythm of the whole thing and when a fly out would happen, I would spend a night in a hotel at the very end just so that I could, shower and get everything all packed up and everything like that ahead of time. But I would much prefer to do this as a camping type of trip. Now, the one setup that I have, the one negative in this is camping. I'm going to get to that in logistics later. Camping availability looks to be a bit of a question mark. So we'll talk more about that in a few minutes. As I mentioned before, excellent resources. This is an ACA trip, so you can take a look at the ACA maps. Again, I'll have a link in the show notes on that. But I found even when there are good resources like the ACA maps, sometimes you can get by with just the Ride with GPS maps and the list of resources that some folks provide within their accounts, and then they end up sharing them with everybody. And this is certainly true of this ride. I want to pull it up. Do I have a user? My man or woman or person, TW Corman. Thank you for sharing all this really quite amazing and detailed list of the route. Not only just the route, but all the camping sites. There's also, it looks like there's hotels and cabins. It looks like there's water and restaurants that are listed here as well. That it's just really, really helpful to have that kind of stuff. It's an interesting thing. Quick sidebar on all of that. I do have to wonder what the ACA thinks about this type of a resource being available, because you could conceivably 100% do this ride based on the freely shared resources like TW Corman did here on Ride with GPS. And, of course you can't, trademark or copyright a cycling route. You can't do that at all. Now you can copyright the maps and the specific ways that you put it out there. That certainly is what the ACA does. And I think that that's where they would land on. They would say, look, if you want to just use that Ride with GPS thing, that's great. But we think that we give the added value with all of the resources and all the things that we do and how we package it and how the maps are constructed, and you get a physical map, not an app on a phone. I think that's probably what their argument would be. But I'd be very curious what they think about internally, how, frankly, they probably lose some business because someone will ride the route and then provide the information that they also have in another format. It's a tough thing, but they do just fine, I think, with the maps that they sell and the services that they provide. They're excellent, and it is a real service that they do provide, especially when they come up with these kinds of routes. Let's talk a little bit about some of the downsides. I've alluded to a few. First thing that I'll mention is that this does get rural real quick. There are limited services in spots. And when I say that, that would be limited campgrounds, limited water, limited food, limited everything. Texas as a state is actually really quite privately owned. There is very little public land there. And so that's one of the tricks with this limited services thing. I mean, the first thing you would think of then is, well, okay, then there's opportunities for wild camping. There's certainly opportunities. I don't know if you want to take it, because that certainly would be for the most part on private land. And, I know where I draw the line on my wild camping and my stealth camping. It's not to say that I wouldn't necessarily consider being on private land under certain circumstances. But to be honest, Texas is not a place where I think I would be just going willy-nilly onto private land. Texas is famous for gun ownership. Let's just put it that way. And, that's what's happening there. So the limited services and spots really has consequences, particularly from the where are you lying your head down at night kind of thing. Water is another downside. Again, limited opportunities. There are very few places where there are creeks or things along those lines. I mean, certainly it's certainly possible. I'm going to pull up the map again just to kind of get an idea. There are certainly some areas where there are lakes and features like that. But frankly, those are going to be around areas where there are services and there are opportunities to get water or purchase water or whatever. It's definitely going to be one of those things that even in the spring, it can get pretty hot. So making sure that you carry a ton of water with you. I mean, this is the kind of ride where you don't want to mess around. You don't want to be tapping into your emergency supply of water without knowing that you've got water coming up pretty soon, at least from my perspective. And I've talked about how I approach water in rides like this. I always have an extra, usually half-liter bottle of water that is either in the really bottom holder that I have, the one that's kind of facing down from the bottom tube. I think it's the bottom tube. Anyways, sorry, I cannot remember all the parts of my bike, or otherwise stuffed in a pannier. It's literally out. I have to stop and do something special to get at it. And that kind of makes sure to trigger in me that's okay. I'm reaching for the emergency water bottle. It's now time to get really serious about getting refills. that's something that I would recommend for really any ride, but particularly for rides like this where you're in some heat, you're in some exposure, and you've got limited opportunities for certain stretches for getting more water. It's always good to have that, and it can be the difference between kind of a really bad day and a not so bad day, and not to mention it could save you save your butt under certain circumstances. So anyways, that's the water situation, which, frankly, I've run into before, but it's certainly worth raising for this ride. The last one that I'd really like to mention, and this is, I'll talk a little bit more about this in my assessment section later on, is the city of Austin has been, over the last several years, really sprawling. It's grown a lot. It's a great town. It's attracted a lot of people. It gets compared very favorably to Portland. There's the Keep Portland Weird. Well, there's lots of Keep Austin Weird murals all over the place. But what's happened with that growth, similar to Portland, frankly, is that traffic has gone up. And for cyclists, there have been some bad interactions. I've got a link in the show notes to a Reddit post by a user who it's called Texas Hill Country Loop Terrible First Biking, and it really is worth the read. Terrible First Bike Touring Experience. It's only a paragraph long, but it speaks to some of the issues, and it was from a year ago, so still in the middle of COVID, still with all of the things going on, and it really did kind of as only one entry into things, but it does feel like something that's consistent with some other things that I've been hearing about that area, particularly areas that are north and west of the city of Austin on the route, which would be according to the route or the cue sheet from the Ride with GPS, and I believe the direction that is recommended for the ACA route. That's going to be at the end of the ride. So picture being at the end of 5 or 6 days and having a real tough ride back into Austin. There are options to kind of deal with all of that. I guess I can address that in the logistics section, the assessment section in a little bit. But that's certainly something that looks like a downside to me when looking at this ride. So when you look at everything, this looks to be a beautiful ride, tons of upside, excellent resources that are available. It's all kind of out there, and it definitely looks to be the type of ride that I would really be into. Also a region of the country that I would love to explore a little bit more. I think many of you know my partner's from Oklahoma, and we've done some traveling in Texas when we've been visiting her parents, or when she did a book tour once in Texas for one of her early books. Texas is kind of a cool, interesting place, and that's a part of Texas that I really kind of like. So I think it's really cool. Does does have some downsides as well. I want to talk a little bit about some of the logistics, just thinking about this from bike perspective. I've talked about doing this relatively loaded. Question mark, is this a Brompton capable trip? The Brompton would certainly be a lot easier / cheaper to bring. When I've done some kind of rough outlining of, who are the airlines that would be flying to Austin, my tried and true Alaska Airlines is not one of them. So there are some others that do. I believe there's a direct flight on American. American has changed their bike costs. They're much lower. They're not that $100 per bike kind of a thing, or $150 per segment kind of a thing anymore. So that's a possibility. But the Brompton certainly would be an even cheaper way to do it. When it goes in the overhead, there aren't those additional costs. Southwest has a few direct flights from the DC area. The various airports that we've got that fly Southwest. So I do think that it would be something to take a look at, but I'd have to say the way the terrain is built, that the Brompton would probably not be the ideal bike for this particular trip. It's not that it couldn't do it, but when you've got lots of ups and downs, I think that of the 3 bikes that I have, the Brompton is the least capable of that. I shouldn't say capable. It's certainly capable, but I think it would be the least comfortable bike to do that. And I think that this is one where I'd want to be flying the good big Safari. That would be the most ideal situation there. And so I think that's the one I'd be leaning towards. Some potentially additional cost for the bicycle transport for that. Something to factor in. One other thing about the logistics here, I'd mentioned this before, is it's very, very feasible to fly into the Austin airport and then to bike away. Just looking at where the airport is located relative to the roads and doing a quick little bit of Google Street View, it definitely looks like it's possible to, use the dog's body bag that I've got, fly in with the bike, fold it all up, throw it in my pannier or underneath my rack bag and just roll. That's really, really kind of awesome. I did not look to see if there was a hotel that was really close to the airport or an airport hotel. But the beauty of the whole thing is that there's no car rentals needed at all. And based on, again, my initial assessment, it looks like I wouldn't even need to do any fast forwards with Lyfts or Ubers or anything like that, which frankly, if I brought the full-size bike, that's a need. That's not a want, that's a need. The upcoming trip, which I'll talk about in a few weeks down to Florida, one of the great things about having the Brompton is, because I have mentioned a few times that I'm not going to take my life into my hands and bicycle on Disney property, that's when I'm going to utilize. I'll bike as close as I can and then grab a Lyft or an Uber and just throw the Brompton in the back trunk and just go from there. Can't do that with the full-size touring bikes. So I love that in and out aspect of the logistics out of Austin's airport. As I mentioned, mostly camping, but probably some hoteling would be potentially needed. I think that the weather is going to be fine. I don't think there would be any weather-related things, barring some kind of a strange monsoon, which I don't think is really happening that time of year or in the spring in that area. It's a relatively arid part of the country, so I don't think that would be too much of an issue. And I'll talk about it in the initial assessment here at the end, where I kind of give you a little bit of a preview of what I'm thinking of overall here. But the camping does have, I think I mentioned this before, some question marks. So I'll address that in a moment here. Well, I've been talking about, okay, what's the wrap up here? What's my initial assessment here after spending about 20 some odd minutes talking about this to you? I think that, when you look at it, Texas Hill Country gets a ton of great reviews. It is a well-regarded, beautiful area of the country. It's an area of the country that I have very little experience cycling in. Well, I shouldn't say very little. I have no experience cycling in and very little experience just kind of traveling around. I've done it all by car, and it's a place that I would really like to kind of hit, kind of check off of the list. So, it's definitely got all of the characteristics once you're on the bike and rolling around that look like an amazing kind of a ride. I do have to say the one thing that I am unnerved about, and that is a word that I choose very carefully, is the reports of the bad driver interactions. This isn't I'm not feeling so good about Highway 101 because there aren't very good shoulders in there. There are reports of drivers that are quite literally assaulting cyclists in some parts of the state. And, we can sit here and shake our fists in the sky all we want. I certainly do. It's a crime quite literally to do some of the stuff that I've read. But do I really want to risk that kind of a thing? It's a real open question. I think that there are jerks everywhere. I don't think I would have to go too far from here to run into that potential interaction. The problem is that getting into a bad driver interaction when you don't have the resources, if something bad goes on, I'm really, really not into that. So I think that I would try to come up with, do some more research, figure out where the highest likelihood of that happening would be, and then trying to figure out what are some of my options in that area. Are there alternate routes to go? Are there better options for me from a cycling perspective? Or is this something where, the loop is there, but maybe you don't do the loop, you do something in an alternative and fast forward to the end through the areas that are particularly bad. I do have to say it really, I was very gung-ho for this. I almost was ready to pull the trigger on this as my ride, and now I've kind of backed off given this. And I certainly am still considering it, but it got me to start thinking about other rides as well, as alternatives, just given what's going on there. The other thing that could be a real problem, and I've alluded to this whole time, is the camping situation can be a little dodgy. So this is not the kind of ride where you can just roll up to any state park or any campground and say, "Hi, I'm on a bike. Let me in." It's cool, right? The state parks do fill up, and they fill up quickly, especially because it's really popular. And camping became, throughout all of COVID, the thing that people could do when everything else was closed down or they didn't feel safe otherwise. So, I do think that that's a problem, that when you start riding and you realize, or you start planning and you realize all of the state parks have already been filled up before I've even considered picking it, that's kind of a problem. There are city parks, municipal parks, that are through all these towns, and just like on the Trans Am, many of them will allow you to camp there, pitch tent, etc., and that's pretty fantastic. So that's a good possible alternative to that. As I mentioned, I think that wild camping, stealth camping is probably there, but not really. So I think that the camping question mark is pretty big. And I've got a link in the show notes to another Reddit commentator about places to camp while bike packing in the Austin area. And that was actually pretty helpful. And I think that a little more research might be able to kind of erase the question mark. But it's certainly something that would still be there as part of this planning process. I think that one of the things that might be, should I not choose to do the ride this year, is maybe I look to do it in maybe in the fall or maybe next year. That this gives me more lead time to be able to make those reservations. The downside to having to make all those reservations, though, is that really locks you in. There's not a lot of flexibility there. Now, as a planner, as you all know, that kind of fits my mold a little bit. But as someone who's also trying to break free of that, also, it's a bit of a drag. But certain routes require different types of planning, and this strikes me as one of them. I think that when all is said and done, there are certainly some downsides to this route, but boy, I am very, very intrigued with the idea of riding in hill country. I think that the pros outweigh the minuses when all is said and done. I do think that there are considerations that have to be made to overcome the camping question mark and to figure out what I can do to get over this unnerving information I have about bad driver interactions. I'd be curious if any of you have ridden in Texas. We've got both the Texas Hill Country Loop, we've got the Southern Tier, we've got the Route 66. I believe the Route 66 ride goes through Texas, does it? Maybe it doesn't. But if any of you have any experience bicycle touring in Texas, I would love to hear more from you about it. It seems pretty cool in lots of ways, but again, I'd love to hear more, because I'm always looking to learn a little bit from folks listening to the show about what your takes are on all of this. And like I said, this is a little bit of a half-baked, it's a little more. It's a little more into 3/4 baked. But there's much more work for me to do should I choose this as the route that I want to do for the spring, or indeed for a different ride going on. But I have to say, this is something that it's been done. It exists. The ACA is behind it. There is a lot to be said about this particular route. And I don't think that I'm the type of person that I can kind of call a shot and say, this is definitely happening by X date. But it's certainly on my list for spring tours, which is why it is the first entry into the remote route scouting series of episodes. Now, I hope you enjoyed this. This is what we're going to be doing for a few weeks at least for the pod. Next week, of course, we're going to be doing our best of, and that's going to be the best of Pedalshift 166. We'll be continuing the DC to Cincinnati ride. That'll be the episode where we cover the portion of the ride when I was on the Gap. So I hope you enjoy that next week. The following week, we're going to continue the remote route scouting, and this one's a fun one. This one is all road. This is going to be a little chunk of the Eastern Express from Dayton, Ohio to St. Louis, Missouri. Why that section? Well, you're going to have to wait until February 10th when the next episode of Route Scouting on Pedalshift continues. And as always, we like to close out the show with a special shout out to the Pedalshift Society. Because of support from listeners like you, Pedalshift is a weekly bicycle touring podcast with a global community, expanding into live shows and covering new tours like this fall's upcoming bike tour. If you like what you hear, you can support the show for $5, $2, or even $1 a month. And there's one-shot and annual options if you're not into the small monthly thing. Check it all out at pedalshift.net/society. On to the society. Kimberly Wilson, Caleb Jenkinson, Cameron Lean, Andrew McGregor, Michael Hart, Keith Nagel, Brock Dittis, Thomas Skadow, Marco Lowe, Terrence Manson, Harry Telgadis, Chris Barron, Mark Van Ram, Brad Hipwell, Mr. T, Nathan Poulton, Stephen Dickerson, Vince LaGreco, Cody Florchinger, Tom Beninati, Greg Braithwaite, Sandy Pizzio, Jeff Muster, Seth Pollock, Joseph Quinn, Drew Porter, Byron Patterson, Joaquin Robber, Ray Jackson, Jeff Fry, Kenny Mikey, Lisa Hart, John Denkler, Steve Henkel, Miguel Quinones, Alejandro Aviles Reyes, Keith Spangler, Greg Towner, Jody Zeranin, Lucas Barwick, Michael Baker, Brian Bechtal, Reinhard Bigel, Greg Middlemiss, Connie Moore, William Gothman, Brian Benton, Joan Churchill, Mike Bender, Rick Weinberg, Billy Crafton, Gary Matushak, Greg Latoile Lopez, James Sloan, Jonathan Dillard, John Funk, Ronald Paroli, Dave Roll, Brian Hafner, Misha Laban, Ari Messenger, David Kropke, Todd Grossbeck, Wally Estrella, Sue Reinert, John Lico, Stephen Granada, Philip Mueller, Robert Lackey, Dominic Carroll, Jackie McCullough, John Hickman, Carl Presso, David Neves, Patty Louise, Terry Fitzgerald, Peter Steinmetz, Timothy Fitzpatrick, Michael Azuski, Hank O'Donnell, David Zanoni, David Weil, Matthew Sponseller, Chad Reno, Spartan Dale, Carolyn Ferguson, Peggy Littlefield, Lauren Allensmith, Eric Burns, Thomas Pearl, Darren McKibben, Richard Stewart, Dave Fletcher, Jack Smith, Luke Parkinson, and new to the society, Ryan Patterson. And thanks also to all past and anonymous folks for helping make this show happen. Thank you for joining. You can find Pedalshift at pedalshift.net for more great bicycle touring content. You can hear the Pedalshift project through Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast app. Opening music courtesy of Jason Kent off his self-titled album. The track is called America. Check out his band Sunfield's latest release, Mono Mono, wherever cool music is available.